During this class, I've really been thinking about my ideologies as a teacher and what I think it means to be a literate student in the classroom. During our exercise where we were looking at the programs and the Houghton Mifflin readers, I really had to start thinking about what I believe would be the best implementation of a literacy program. I really believe in the benefits of Reader's Workshop, but I wanted to do some research as to why I believe that. And so for my project, I decided to look into the research and background behind sustained silent reading and why this was best practice in the classroom. First, I started by looking up the history of sustained silent reading. Where did it come from? So I found out that in 1960, there was a professor at the University of Vermont who thought that teaching of literacy was being overtaught, that teachers are spending too much time on drill and practice, on literacy skills, and not giving students enough time to practice those skills. So Dr. Hunt came up with the program called SSR, or Sustained Silent Reading. His main beliefs were that students become better readers by actually reading more. And when he's talking about reading more, he's not necessarily talking about basal readers and passages. He's talking about authentic trade books at a student's level. He also believed that, like I said, teachers spend too much time teaching literacy through direct instruction, and students weren't actually having time to practice the skills that they were being taught in an authentic way. He developed the program SSR, or Sustained Silent Reading, under 4 guiding principles. And those principles are, first, of course, like we said, reading is overtaught and under practice. And in fact, there were many studies that I came across that said best practice is to spend 20% of your time in instruction or direct instruction, and 80% of the time students should be actually practicing what they learned, whether that be through silent reading or guided reading or some authentic use of text. The second principle is that contextual reading is more important than word recognition. So Dr. Hunt believed that students, when they come to a word that they don't know, don't often have as much trouble with the decoding as they do with the meaning within the sentence. Teachers, in fact, spend a lot of time on decoding skills and are very successful in teaching students decoding skills. That he found that the contextual reading is where there is lacking instruction. Interestingly, the third principle is that silent reading is more important and appropriate than oral reading. I thought that was interesting because a lot of teachers stress reading out loud, that students, especially struggling students, need to read out loud to make sure that they're reading it correctly. But what Dr. Hunt said is that students, especially struggling students, will get more out of silent reading because they can read more in a shorter amount of time if they read silently. Finally, readers have the right to engage in reading activities on their own terms. So this means that students should be able to select their own reading material, they should be able to set their own purpose for reading, and they should be able to make meaning in their own way rather than being told what a text means and how to interpret it. They should have open-ended questions and ways that they can interpret what they read on their own. So my first question in my research project was basically, is this effective? Is giving students time to read effective? And what I found was that, in fact, it is effective, but it's most effective when it's embedded within a program that encourages dialogue, one-on-one conferring, read-alouds, and guided reading as other components of the reading program. So students are choosing their own text and reading quietly, but there's also other components going on while that's happening. There was an interesting study I came across that studied the high-gain schools versus low-gain schools in the reading instruction that was implemented at both. And what it basically found was that high-gain schools spend a lot more time on reading instruction, and the time that is spent on reading instruction, the students are actually reading, as compared to low-gain schools where students spend more time in non-reading activities during that same reading period. Similarly to what we talked about at the beginning of the course, high-achieving first graders read on average 261 words per day as compared to their low-achieving peers that read only 90 words per day. And this kind of speaks to the fact that low-performing students need to read more if they're going to get better at reading. Coming back to the point about oral reading, low-performing students are made to read orally more often than their high-performing counterparts. Often, teachers will spend time asking low performers to read out loud to them in small group, while the high performers go off to read silently. And according to the SSR model and the Reader's Workshop studies that I read, it should actually be not the other way around, but everyone should be reading silently. Finally, young readers should spend more time reading silently since more text can be read silently than orally during the same period of time, so kind of supporting why silent reading is important. I also wanted to look at, does sustained silent reading affect a reader's attitude towards reading? I'm actually using a reader's workshop in my classroom this year, and I had some parent feedback that actually their students seem to like reading more this year with the more time to actually read. So it was interesting to see that it can, in fact, boost student attitude towards reading. It's been proven to increase students' intrinsic motivation to read, and it said the earlier that a teacher or teachers or a school were to implement a sustained silent reading program or one that is embedded with that type of framework, the more likely the students are to develop positive feelings towards reading. I found one study, which I thought was cool, that students who participated in sustained silent reading type programs in their classroom were more likely to read for pleasure once they left that classroom. So you're giving that intrinsic motivation. And finally, there is a strong link between intrinsic motivation to read and the availability of interesting books, regular opportunities for students to choose their own reading material, and regular opportunities for students to collaborate and discuss their reading, which sounds a lot like the Reader's Workshop model that I believe is best for students. So thinking about how can you use sustained silent reading, and like many things in education, there's a continuum. So some teachers might say sustained silent reading should simply be just that students are reading silently. And it does have its benefits. My personal belief is the Reader's Workshop model, where sustained silent reading is embedded within a framework where the teacher is spending some of the time on direct instruction, different reading strategies. The students then go off and read their own text on their own terms, but the teacher then spends time conferring with each student, finding out who they are as readers, then using small guided reading groups to reinforce the skills that the student may be lacking. And finally, the social piece, where students then at the end of Reader's Workshop time close up their books and get with a partner and share what they're reading about. Because in the end, reading should and could actually be a very social activity, or is in social in nature. So I believe Reader's Workshop is one way that teachers could implement SSR effectively. Of course, there are teachers, and we included, of course, that need to find how to get past kind of the roadblocks, because like anything, it's not perfect. And so some of the concerns about silent reading are, how do teachers keep students accountable for the time that they're using during Reader's Workshop? And this model that I found, called scaffolded silent reading, to me sounded a lot like Reader's Workshop, where teachers discuss and model fluent reading with students. They read their books, and the teacher confers with each child and listens to them read, essentially giving you time to assess whether they are or are not reading during Reader's Workshop. I found that it's probably not appropriate to ask students to continuously write comprehension. We had a meeting with Pat Johnson at my school, and one comment she made that really stuck with me is, if a teacher wants to kill reading, they'll add a bunch of post-its, a bunch of journaling, comprehension questions, all those sorts of things to kind of take the fun out of it, take the pleasure out of it. That it should really truly be authentic in the real world. You don't read and then get asked to mark post-its unless you're studying for a test, which would be another type of instruction. So I think it is really important that sustained silent reading be authentic, and teachers need to work around that model. And finally, how do teachers make sure that students are reading just right material? And oftentimes, even in my own classroom, I find that kids want to either read something too easy or too hard. And so knowing my students, their interests and their prior knowledge will help me monitor that. But also we spend a lot of time on teaching students how to choose appropriate books and scaffold that process of how do you know if a book is just right. In conclusion, I believe that sustained silent reading, when embedded within an appropriate implementation framework such as Reader's Workshop, certainly has a lot of benefits for students and for teachers. That students will find joy and achievement during their reading, and teachers will find that they truly know their students as readers. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I apologize for not being able to be there, but I hope you enjoy.